A warm June morning in Michigan. Commuters hurried through the town square, and children chased each other across the green. On a weathered wooden bench by the old war memorial, a frail 78-year-old man sat alone with his eyes downcast. He was as unremarkable to the crowd as a rusted statue on a street corner. Day after day, people passed him by without a second glance, until today, this morning, would be different. A decorated general in full uniform strode across the park, his medals glinting in the sun. As he walked, laughter and chatter filled the air. But suddenly, the general stopped in his tracks as if he'd seen a ghost. His gaze locked on the hunched old man on the bench. In an instant, the general's face softened into awe. He took a sharp breath, clicked his polished heels together, and stood at rigid attention. Then, ever so slowly, he raised his right hand in a salute. Conversation in the park died to a stunned hush. Joggers halted mid-stride. A dog stopped barking. Every eye turned toward the extraordinary sight, a powerful 60-year-old general saluting a bent, tired old man whom everyone else had ignored. The old man's cloudy eyes widened in disbelief. His lips trembled, and he gingerly struggled to his feet, unsure how to respond to such an honor. No one in that park understood what was happening. Who was this elderly stranger, and why was a high-ranking officer showing him the utmost respect? In that frozen moment, an unsung story from decades past began to surface, one that would bring an entire town to tears. Before we uncover that story, take a moment to remember the hidden heroes around us. If you also believe that quiet, forgotten heroes deserve recognition in this world, join us by subscribing. John Baker had become a fixture of the town over the years, a silent figure who appeared every morning on the same bench by the memorial. He would arrive just after sunrise, nod politely to the pigeons that gathered at his feet, and sit with a worn leather bag by his side. Inside that bag, beneath a folded newspaper and a ham sandwich for lunch, lay a bundle of old letters and a frayed photograph from decades ago. Those were his private memories, reminders of a life and a war that he never spoke about. In town, people simply called him the old man in the park. Few even knew his name was John. Each day, life moved around John as if he were invisible. Businessmen in suits power-walked past, busy with phone calls. Young mothers jogged by pushing strollers, casting only a brief glance his way out of curiosity. Occasionally, a child would break free from a parent and stare at John's gentle, time-worn face, only to be quickly pulled along. For most, he was part of the scenery, as ordinary as the park's old oak trees. A couple of teenagers once snickered behind his back, joking that he might be waiting for a friend who'd never come. John heard the giggles but kept his eyes fixed on the ground, pretending not to notice. On cooler days, John wore an old olive-green army jacket with faded patches on the sleeves. Sometimes, a passerby would spot the jacket and ask if he was a veteran. John would only nod and offer a polite smile. He never boasted or gave details. The truth was, John had seen more of war than he cared to remember. A thin scar peeked from his right temple into his gray hairline. He'd earned that in a distant land long ago. But when curious folks pressed him for stories, he would simply shrug and say, "Oh, that was a lifetime ago," then change the subject. He didn't want praise or pity. He only wished the ghosts of the past would let him be. Behind John's bench loomed the town's war memorial, a granite wall etched with names of local boys who never came home. John often ran his fingers gently over a particular name, William Billy Harris, his best friend from the Vietnam War, lost at Khe Sanh. Billy's memory was one of many John carried quietly. To him, those were the true heroes, the ones who sacrificed everything. He felt more comfortable honoring them in silence than standing in any spotlight himself. It made one wonder, how many more silent heroes lived out their days unrecognized, right next to us. Do we really see the quiet elders among us for who they are, or only for what they seem? Share your thoughts below. Early June brought preparations for the town's annual Memorial Day ceremony. American flags were planted along Main Street, and a small podium was set up near the War Memorial. The mayor announced that a special guest would be coming to speak, General Robert Hayden, a decorated officer who had grown up in this very county. The town buzzed with excitement at the news. John watched crews hang bunting and test the microphone in the park. He said nothing, but inside his heart pounded at the sound of the general's name. Hayden, that name tugged at a memory, but he couldn't quite place it. On the morning of the event, John arrived as usual at his bench. He wasn't sure if he should be there during the ceremony. Part of him felt he didn't belong among the crowds of officials and well-dressed guests. He had no medals pinned to his chest, no unit cap or badges. Nothing to show he had once been a soldier, save for the faraway look in his eyes. As people gathered, John moved to the back of the crowd, blending in with the lawn and the shadows. He pulled his frayed cap down low, hoping to remain unseen. He never imagined that soon all eyes would be on him. A festive silence fell as the ceremony commenced. The mayor gave a brief welcome, and the high school band started playing the national anthem. John stood at the very back, the notes of "The Star-Spangled Banner" rumbling in his chest. He bowed his head, hat in hand, feeling a familiar tightness in his throat as the flag was raised. When the music ended, General Robert Hayden took the podium amid polite applause. John lifted his eyes just enough to see the man in uniform at the front. The general was tall and dignified, with silver hair catching the light. John's heart swelled with a mix of admiration and something else, an inexplicable connection he couldn't yet name. As the general began to speak, John tried to inch a little closer, hoping to hear every word. He took a few steps forward, hovering near the roped-off section reserved for honored guests and veterans. Just then, a young event organizer in a navy blazer noticed him. The man approached with a courteous but firm smile. "Excuse me, sir," he whispered. "This area is for invited veterans and family members only." John blinked, a bit taken aback. I am a veteran," he said quietly, his voice almost lost in the murmurs of the crowd. The organizer hesitated, eyeing John's humble clothes and frail stance with doubt. He had seen the uniformed veterans already seated up front, their caps, badges, and pressed jackets. John didn't fit that picture. "Of course," the young man nodded politely, not wanting to argue, "but please, stay behind the ropes. We have a full house today." He gestured for John to step back. A flush of embarrassment crept up John's cheeks. He lowered his gaze and shuffled back behind the thin rope that separated him from the rows of seats. No one else seemed to notice the small exchange. The crowd was focused on the general's speech. But John felt a sting in his heart. He hadn't wanted special treatment, yet being shooed away like an intruder made him feel smaller than ever. If you believe no hero's sacrifices should ever be forgotten, then stand with us. John swallowed hard, trying to ignore the sense of exclusion. On stage, General Hayden's voice carried through the loudspeakers. The general was recounting a story from the Vietnam War, a story of bravery under fire. John listened, initially curious, then increasingly astonished. The tale the general told was eerily familiar. Hayden spoke of a young private, his own father, pinned down with his unit on a jungle hillside decades ago. Surrounded and wounded, the unit was near collapse when a fellow soldier risked his life to save them. That soldier took command after the officers had fallen. He rallied the men and held off the enemy until help arrived, all while carrying wounded comrades to safety one by one. John's breath caught in his chest. He clutched the rope in front of him for support as vivid memories flooded his mind. The sunlit park faded from his senses, replaced by the deafening roar of gunfire and the choking heat of that long-ago battlefield. In his mind's eye, John was 23 again, crouched in the tall elephant grass of Vietnam. Bullets hissed past his ears. He could smell the smoke and sweat. He could hear the cries of the injured echoing through the trees. He remembered that day with painful clarity. His platoon had been ambushed and their lieutenant was killed in the first wave of bullets. A young private named Robert Hayden Sr. lay beside him, bleeding and terrified, just 19 years old with a newborn son waiting for him at home. John had locked eyes with the frightened kid and knew what he had to do. Ignoring the shrapnel burning in his own arm, John crawled forward, took charge of the panicked soldiers and returned fire. He barked orders with authority he didn't technically have, rallying the men to form a defensive line. Grenades shook the ground. When one of his comrades fell, John hoisted the injured man over his shoulder and dragged him behind a shattered tree trunk for cover. He made trip after trip, each time exposing himself to enemy fire to pull another wounded friend to safety, including Private Hayden. At one harrowing moment, John had dropped his last magazine of ammo. Private Hayden, trembling and pale, had passed him a fresh clip with blood-slick fingers. "Cover me," John had shouted, pressing Hayden's hand over another injured soldier's wound. Then John rose up, just enough to draw the enemy's attention, and fired steadily until the hills fell silent. By the time reinforcements arrived, John had saved the lives of at least a dozen men, but among the fallen was Billy Harris, his best friend. John found Billy with a fatal wound, his lifeless eyes still open as if looking for dawn. John had closed those eyes with a shaking hand, tears and mud on his face. It was the hardest moment of his life. A thunderous round of applause jolted John back to the present. General Hayden had finished the story. He was now looking out at the crowd with a solemn expression. "That unknown soldier," the general said, voice cracking slightly, "never received the medals he deserved. He returned home and faded into obscurity. But if it weren't for him, dozens of American families, mine included, would have lost their sons and fathers." John stood frozen in place. It was his story the general was telling. It had to be. The memories he'd kept locked away for so long were now spoken aloud on a bright stage to hundreds of people. His heart pounded wildly. Did General Hayden know? John's vision blurred with tears as he watched the man on stage. The general's gaze seemed to be scanning the back of the crowd now, searching. In that moment, John wanted to shrink away and disappear, but something held him rooted to the spot. General Hayden stepped away from the podium, ignoring the confused whispering of the mayor and the other officials seated behind him. The general walked down the steps of the stage and began striding straight into the audience. A murmur rippled through the attendees as they parted to let him through. John's heart thumped in his chest. The old man glanced over his shoulder, wondering if the general was headed for someone else, but there was nobody behind John, only the maple tree that stood at the park's edge. The general's steel-blue eyes were fixed firmly on him. The crowd fell into an uneasy hush, curious and baffled. John's pulse roared in his ears. He felt faint, as if he were standing on that battlefield again with adrenaline coursing through him. General Hayden came to a stop directly in front of John. For a second, that felt like an eternity. The decorated officer and the old veteran just looked at one another. John opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. And then the general snapped his boots together and raised his right hand in a crisp, respectful salute to John Baker. For a heartbeat, John couldn't move. His mind struggled to process the honor being given to him. Slowly, he managed to raise a trembling hand to his brow and return the salute. Two veterans in the front row, who had fought in wars of their own, immediately stood at attention. One by one, every soldier and ex-soldier present followed, saluting the old warrior. The rest of the crowd, realizing they were witnessing a profound moment, fell silent out of respect. General Hayden held the salute a moment longer, then lowered his arm and offered John his hand. "Sergeant John Baker," the general said warmly, loud enough for those nearby to hear, "I've been waiting a long time to meet you, sir." His voice wavered with emotion as he called John, "Sir." It was a gesture of deep respect from a general to a sergeant, and it made John's eyes brim with tears. John clasped the general's hand in both of his, words failing him. All he could whisper was, "I'm honored, General." A ripple of whispers went through the crowd as people began to understand. This was the very hero from the general's story. "Did he say John Baker?" someone muttered. "Is that the man from the speech?" Another gasped, hand over her heart. Then, as if on cue, applause erupted. It started with a few claps and swelled into a standing ovation that echoed across the park. John felt a gentle tug on his sleeve. The young event organizer who had turned him away was now at his side. The man's face was flushed with shame and awe. I'm so sorry, sir," he stammered. John, with a faint smile, simply nodded and patted the young man's shoulder, letting him know he held no grudge. General Hayden turned to the audience, his hand still on John's shoulder as if presenting a long-lost family member. "Ladies and gentlemen," the general announced, voice ringing out strong now, "this is Sergeant John Baker, the brave soldier I told you about. He is the reason I am standing here today." A collective murmur of astonishment and appreciation swept through the onlookers. Some had tears in their eyes. The mayor hurried forward and gave John a firm handshake, bowing his head in gratitude. A few local reporters snapped photos, capturing the moment an unsung hero finally stepped into the light. John stood taller than he had in years. His loneliness, his daily vigil at the park, the feeling of being forgotten, all of it dissolved in that blood of gratitude. He glanced at the faces in the crowd. He saw the two teenagers who used to snicker at him. Now they were wide-eyed and silent, one of them even wiping away a tear as he raised a shaky salute of his own. John's gaze drifted to the war memorial, where the name of his friend Billy was etched. He silently dedicated this honor to those who hadn't made it back. As the applause died down, the general leaned in and spoke softly for John's ears alone. "Dad always said he owed his life to you. And so do I." John's breath caught. He finally understood. The general was the infant son that Private Hayden had yearned to see. John's sacrifice decades ago had allowed that boy to grow up, to become the man now standing before him. John could hardly speak, so he simply placed his hand on the general's cheek in a gesture of fatherly affection, a tear rolling down his own cheek. In the days that followed, John Baker became the pride of the town. Strangers came up to shake his hand. Neighbors delivered warm, home-cooked meals, making sure he no longer ate dinner alone, as he had for years since his wife passed away. And the children who played in the park now gathered around eagerly whenever John was ready to share a gentle story. He never glorified war, but he spoke of loyalty and friendship. The mayor announced that every year on Veterans Day, the town would honor John and all veterans like him, so no hero would ever be overlooked again. John was even given a place of honor at the next parade, riding beside General Hayden, who had promised to keep in touch. Before that day, John had felt invisible, a mere footnote in history. Now he understood that his life had meant something profound to so many. The quiet old man who had changed the fate of a dozen families was invisible no more. Sometimes, the most ordinary-looking people are the ones who have changed the course of history. John's story reminded everyone in town never to take a stranger at face value, and to show kindness and respect to all, for among us may walk the heroes we know nothing about. With a final look at the memorial wall, John touched Billy's name and whispered, "We did it, old friend. They remember us now." His heart, once heavy with solitude, felt light. As the sun began to set over the park, John sat back down on his familiar bench. But this time, he wasn't alone. A group of townspeople and fellow veterans had gathered around, eager to hear from the hero in their midst. John looked at the faces now, full of admiration and gratitude, and a peaceful smile crept across his face. In that golden evening light, the old soldier finally knew he would never be forgotten again.